just sort of array all of my accoutrements here.
Okay.
I hope I didn't forget anything. That's my dread whenever I do one of these. I almost walked out and forgot the figure. That would have really made it challenging. So.
How did you get so much in such a small box?
I don't know how to answer that question.
Bigger on the
I wasn't
inside
able to
than
close it,
outside.
let's put it that way.
Hard as
Okay.
cigar boxes.
Yeah, I kind of got into cigar smoking recently, so
Just so you can get the boxes.
it's a nasty habit. Yeah, I really like those boxes. I'm gonna talk a little bit. I've got a figure here that I'm just getting underway, and he's a little crude at the moment, but I think he's at a stage where I can at least demonstrate a couple of techniques here. Obviously, the process of getting this guy completely ready to go and ready to paint is going to go through a number of sessions, but the guy that I'm doing, this figure is going to be a depiction of George Pap Green. And George Green was a brigadier general in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he was from Rhode Island, but he was given command of a brigade that consisted entirely of New York troops. And he served prior to Gettysburg, but his big 15 minutes of fame were at the Battle of Culp's Hill on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Pap Green his brigade was part of the 12th Corps, Henry Slocum's 12th Corps. And they were stationed at Culp's Hill on the extreme northern end of the line, the top of the fishhook at Gettysburg. And Culp's Hill's a small hill, but around the back of it was the Baltimore Turnpike, the pike that went all the way down to Baltimore. If the Confederates were able to turn his flank. Everybody knows about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine being on one end of the line. Well, Pap Green was on the other end of the line. And his end of the line was just as heavily assaulted as Chamberlain's was. Chamberlain just was a little more, verbose and a little more eloquent in extolling the accomplishments of him and his brigade after the war than modest old Pap Green was. Pap Green that was his name, his nickname. His men called him Pop Green, actually. I say Pap Green. Pop Green, because he was a father-like figure to these guys. And there's a monument to him that stands overlooking Culp's Hill, and this is a photograph of the bronze monument. You can see the trees all around. It's a very heavily wooded area, but it's a very steep hill leading up to it through the woods. And these monuments were many of them were done right after the battle. Well, right after the battle, over the next 20, 30 years after the battle. Some of them, there's some very recent. Ron Tunison has done a couple of Crawford and a few other things. But it's interesting that a lot of these that were done close enough to the time that there were still people who were alive and well, who remembered very well what happened that day. So there's some accuracy generally in the way these guys were depicted, not just their faces, but what they wore. What's interesting to note in this picture is that he's wearing a sack coat, he's not wearing an officer's double-breasted frock coat, which most of them posed for when they sat for photographers. And the sack coat was a much more comfortable, casual garment worn mostly by enlisted men. But a lot of generals chose to wear sack coats when they were in the field because they were more comfortable. They had they could custom make them with some extra pockets for maps and other things, order books and so on and so forth. So he's wearing that sack coat, and the hat he's depicted wearing, I've seen a number of photographs, seems very much like the hat that he wore. Officers bought their own hats. They weren't issued hats. They went out and had to spend their own money on those. But really interesting thing to me, I was kind of cruising. The internet's such an incredible resource. It's just amazing. But I was cruising through the internet, and most of the photos I was able to find of Green had him with 2 stars on his shoulder, and of course those 2 stars depict Major General. But Pap Green at the time was a brigadier general, 1-star general. And I found this photograph, and unfortunately it's a little grainy. I blew it up bigger than the resolution really required, but what a great picture that is for a soldier. for a model soldier. Now that is not a guy sitting for a photographer in his best uniform. That looks like what he wore in the field.
Plaid shirt?
He's got a kind of a homespun shirt,
right.
checkered shirt. It's unbuttoned. His coat's unbuttoned. He's wearing the sack coat, and there's one star on his shoulder. He became a major general in the year or so after Gettysburg. So this has the ring of truth to me, that outfit. So I'm looking at this pose, and it's sort of a classic 19th century heroic. Where are the bad guys? Well, they're over there. That's where they are, kind of thing. And so they look great on monuments. I kind of decided to do that, but I'm not going to have him looking as buttoned up as this. My guy is going to be looking a little more like that guy. What's cool about Green is he's got this sort of spade-shaped beard, and he's a little gray hair. He's kind of salt and pepper hair, kind of like a lot of us guys here. And but he's got this big, luxurious mustache, and he's got some really unique features to his appearance, which will be kind of fun to depict in sculpting this guy. Okay, so let me acquaint some of you here with my process here.
He's a little cross-eyed.
Well, it might be it might just be the depression under his brow there. I'm not sure about that. I don't think so. I think if you look really closely, you can see some more white in the eyes on the one side. Yeah.
Maybe I'm cross-eyed.
But really neat picture. And these sack coats were generally a little oversized. And you can also see, look at some other things you can pick up. For one thing, look at his hat. It looks like it's dented on one side. Now, I'm not sure if that's a flaw in the photograph or what. But in any event, it looks like a lived-in hat. It looks like a hat he wore a lot.
Punched it down.
Yeah, it might be punched down a little bit. The other thing that's interesting, if you look at that, you can see his sword. He's actually grasping his sword, and if you look closely, it looks to me, Jim, like it's a gunmetal sheath with probably brass fittings on it.
That's a good guess. I mean, it's pretty simple.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a leather. It wouldn't be leather, but it looks like the steel on the scabbard is a darker steel than the color of the fittings. The fittings would have been brass.
It's metallic.
Yeah. And swords are always a little bit of a challenge because a lot of these guys carried personal swords that might have been in the family in the battle. My father's sword, or a presentation sword, or this is the sword that my great grandfather carried in the Revolution, or some story like that. And then other officers went into the Civil War with no sword, and they had to go out and get one, and so they bought one, and they bought one of a typical design that was out at the time. So this is really useful because it looks like he's in the field.
It's a field officer's sword. It's not fancy.
It's an officer's sword. It looks like it's a fairly standard officer's design, but that definitely looks like it gives you an idea of how to make it as accurate as possible. And that's the key when you're trying to get something right, is to try to see how much information you can get. Some of these guys you can get quite a lot. Some of these guys that you do from the Civil War, you have to make a lot of educated guesses. You have to make some educated guesses anyway, but that if I'm thinking George Green at Gettysburg, that's what I'm thinking it looked like. And this is a stunning photograph. I couldn't find a better resolution. I can only find it on one website. I don't know where the hell that is, but cool picture. So anyway, I've got my guy depicted, kind of like the statue. I haven't done his arms yet. I've just got the basic shape, and for those of you who haven't seen this presentation before, I usually start off with my figures in a fairly rough mode because they're all going to be covered with clothing. Some sculptors like to get a little more, anatomically precise sculpting at this stage. I like to make sure I have all my proportions right, but I don't really worry too much about the coarseness of the details because I'm going to cover that up with some nice smooth clothing here to begin, after the fact. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that I've got here. I've got an X-Acto knife. I've got my...
Can I ask a basic question?
Sure.
Do you have a wire skeleton inside that, or is that just strictly...
I do.
material?
Thank you. That's a very good question. There's... I have a resin armature on this. And the resin armature are the two shoes. These are sculptures of mine that Brad cast these for me. And I've got a resin pelvis and a resin torso. and then I've got a resin head. And they're all held together with a good old office paper clip, which I've been using for almost 25 years now.
There's something in there to give it the body where you're carving.
The wire forms them together. You can actually see the wire of his leg down the back, and that's covered over in just the 2-part A&B putty. And a lot of putties out there. You don't need to use the ones I'm using. These are the ones I've always used. I could change to some of the other ones. There's a lot of really good putties out there right now, and everybody has their own preferences. I've been using these materials for a long time, so I'm used to them. If I was starting today, I might experiment with some other things, but if it isn't broke, don't fix it. So I'm kind of still sticking with what I've always used. And the way I like to use these, let me just talk a little bit about the consistency here. He's just supposed to speak when he's spoken to. So. A&B putty is putty that's been around a long time. I mean, it goes back to the 60s. It's a 2-part epoxy putty. It dries very hard. It's also a little grainy. It's not really ideal, I don't think, for finished portions of the figure that you're going to paint directly. Now you can use it that way. It just requires more work. When you try to get into small detail, it doesn't hold the small detail very well. It tends to break up a little bit. It's just not very good for that. This is, I still call this Duro, but now it's technically called Kneadatite because Duro they went out of the epoxy putty business years ago and sold their product licenses to a company called Kneadatite, so now it's called Kneadatite. A lot of people call it green stuff. It's obviously not green, but when you put blue and yellow together, you get green. Been using this ever since I started sculpting. This is a very, very versatile putty. But it actually, when you mix the 2 parts together, you mix them into a long little cylinder, let them completely dry, they'll actually bend a little bit. It's got some suppleness to it. It dries to what I like to call the consistency of sort of firm tire rubber, but it's very, very fine grain, which means it's ideal for painting over, and it's also ideal for sculpting little details, from buttons to little braid pieces to facial features to hair to beards. Any fine detail Duro is great for. Now the other, kind of getting to the Hershey's or the Reese's peanut butter cup part of the talk, you can put the chocolate and the peanut butter together. These two actually blend really well together. They're both 2-part epoxy putties. And great idea that I wished I thought of myself, but a friend of mine in Italy told me about, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, that did you know you can mix these and they really work good for a lot of other things? And I said, well, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know that. And I tried it, and doggone it if he wasn't right. So nowadays I do a lot of my sculpting for clothing and basic uniforms.